It is undeniable that both of Jimi Hendrix's power trio formations were genre-defining moments in rock history. But who were the people that played with Jimi? Hello and welcome to another episode of Hendrix Up Close. Today we're dealing with a really interesting topic. We are going to look at the Jimi Hendrix experience and the Band of Gypsies and look at them in the context of the development of the power trio format. And we're gonna hear interviews from all those musicians, people that Jimi played with, as well as his longtime friend Roger Mayer. And we're gonna see how Jimi's music covered so much ground in just 4 short years, suddenly abruptly ended by his unfortunate death. Before we get started, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and for future notifications, please ring the bell and sign up. It's the fall of 1966, and a musical revolution is about to happen. There's all this 3-piece formation shooting out of the ground. One of the most famous ones, Cream.
People who want to scream and jump in, we never did that anyway. I mean, we never did all that on stage leaping about crap that all these other bands do. We never did that, and we never will. We just played music, and it was Cream sold itself on its music, not on anybody gyrating on stage. That never happened, and it still doesn't happen, you know.
As we hear in this interview by the late Ginger Baker, for Cream it was always all about the music. And even though it was a rock formation, a lot of the music happened in a jazz context. Baker, being a jazz drummer, and Jack Bruce, who also played upright, gave this band a jazz interplay. And that's a very important characteristic of these power trios. And suddenly, when you only have 3 musicians, there's so much more space to cover, and it kind of gets rid of the traditional rock setting of lead guitar, rhythm guitar, rhythm instruments and lead instruments, but instead it becomes more of a chamber musical experience. And I do believe that Jimi Hendrix experience was very similar in that aspect to Cream because they also had a jazz drummer, Mitch Mitchell.
It could have been, I mean, it's like the second trio as such. You know, Noel had come from a straight English rock and roll band. Jimi was influenced by whatever he'd been working with. I come from, I don't know, you know, maybe like a sort of fringe, sort of pseudo Brooks Brothers suits, jazz sort of scene, you know. It's just finding people that you're compatible with musically, which, you know, is very, very difficult to find. I found possibly like 3 or 4 people I'd have playing for, you know, a few years. And I think he felt the same way. It was a very close band in a very, very abstract way. Everyone had very firm ideas about what they wanted. Unfortunately, at certain times, there were only like maybe 2/3 aiming for the same thing.
It is funny to know that Jimi almost fired Mitch Mitchell in those early days of the experience because he would show up to rehearsals late. He didn't show much discipline. But fortunately for us, their relationship became one of the most important collaborations in Jimi's career. Let's hear it from Chris Layton, drummer of Stevie Ray Vaughan and the Experience Hendrix Tour, and his approach of how he saw Mitch Mitchell.
And he told me all these great stories, you know, and I asked him what he thought about rock and roll. He thought it was vile rubbish. He said, oh, you know, Elvin Jones and Philly Joe Jones and Max Roach and all these people. He's a jazz guy who met Jimi Hendrix, and they created a whole thing that was kind of, in a strange way, kind of out of context.
And suddenly, when you only have 3 musicians, there's so much more space to cover, and it kind of gets rid of the traditional rock setting of lead guitar, rhythm guitar, you know, rhythm instruments and lead instruments, but instead it becomes more of a chamber musical experience.
It is, thinking back, that Jimi could not only sing, he could sing and play at the same time. Now, there's not many guitar players that can do that. B.B. King can play the guitar, but when he sings, he stops playing the guitar. There's many, many guitar players actually physically stop playing the guitar while they're singing. Now, Jimi could sing and play at the same time, and that is unique. You don't see that very often.
So in which ways did Jimi redefine the power trio format? Compared to Cream, Hendrix was way more influenced by soul and R&B because he was from the States, whereas Clapton, Bruce and Baker only heard all those recordings secondhand. And Jimi really played in the Chitlin circuit for years and knew this music inside out. You could see that suddenly things really started happening in a very short amount of time. When the Jimi Hendrix Experience was formed, they barely had any time to rehearse before they started recording. Chas Chandler literally put this band together in a few days. Noel Redding was originally a guitar player and session musician, but he was just looking for work. Here is a rare interview where we hear how it all started happening for him.
At which point, Mr. Chas Chandler, the late bass player from the Animals and our producer and manager, God bless him, came up to me and said, "Can I play bass?" And I said, "No, but I'll give it a go." And I did. We played 3 tunes with this American gentleman, myself, keyboard player and a drummer. And this American gentleman said, would you like to go down the pub? Which is, most musicians say, of course. And we went down to this little pub and had a pint of bitter, which he was just getting used to. And we were talking about music. He was asking me about the English music scene. I was asking about the American music scene. I'd never been there at that point. And then he said, would I like to join his group? And that was it. That was Mr. James Hendrix.
So the experience was catapulted into stardom, and they must have been working incredibly hard. Not only were they constantly touring, but they basically put out 3 albums in the course of just 1.5 years. And it's not a surprise that when you work that intensely, friction is created as well. Noel Redding wasn't a natural sideman bass player. He had his own musical ambitions. But he just took the opportunity to play with this star band. He was a working musician, and of course he wanted to work. It seems that Mitch Mitchell was way more dedicated to the band. And it's funny to see that Hendrix was basically struggling with the same things that a lot of bands, including simple garage bands, are struggling with. That some members are more dedicated and some are a little less. But the frictions really started when Jimi started working on Electric Ladyland. Other than on his first 2 records that happened fairly quickly, he now would take his sweet time to perfecting his tones, his arrangement, and all the parts of the recording. Sometimes he would record 50 takes of the same song. And that sure must have been very tiring for the band. It definitely got tiring for Jazz Chandler, who just decided to quit and fly back to England. In February of 1969, Noel Redding got seriously fed up with Jimi's behavior and work ethic, and he gives the following memory. On the first day, as I nearly expected, there was nothing to do. On the second day, it was no show at all. I went to the pub for 3 hours, came back, and it was still ages before Jimi ambled in. Then we argued. On the last day, I just watched it happen for a while, and then went back to my flat. So when Jimi announced that Noel Redding would no longer be with the Hendrix Experience, Redding immediately went back to England, and Jimi immediately got in touch with his old pal Billy Cox, that he had already played with and lived with back in his Nashville days around 1963.
Right, so I was surprised. I said, well, why me, man, wow. So, I was proud of his success. So we got together, and they told me him and Buddy were going to do some things, so I did a lot of work in the studio before the Band of Gypsies got together, and finally we got together and did it. So, Buddy didn't stay long. He split, did his own thing. The rest is history.
And put the band together, which was right after Woodstock. Mm-hmm. So in other words, he took some of the elements. When he was on stage at Woodstock, he says, "We're just a band of gypsies." You know that. Right. And that was the key. That was the one clue that you can trace back.
Yeah.
And he wanted to put together this kind of a funkier band, Right. Billy Cox on bass, obviously, fabulous guy, yeah. great musician, good friend of his, and Buddy Miles.
Buddy Miles on drums.
So it was a very powerful rhythm section, there's no question. I mean, Buddy Miles is Mr. Fatback.
And those live albums are
Mitch
amazing.
Mitchell used to say, "Yeah, mate, I tell you, he's amazing. He's like a bloody cement mixer." And
Jimi's band was definitely heavier than any other power trio at the time. And I regard this as one of his legacies that would inspire so many musicians in rock, but also in metal and all the heavy genres.
Everybody thinks that they can play Jimi's music, but you cannot. Even I can't do that. But what made it so unique is that Jimi Hendrix and Billy Cox and myself, and I am not here to put Mitch Mitchell or Noel Redding down, because the Jimi Hendrix experience was certain as just as divine as the Band of Gypsies. But I think the Band of Gypsies, I think that what Jimi was saying is he wanted to more or less go back to his roots, more or less because he was really not just a black man, you know. To me, he just had a very, very universal soul.
It's sometimes easily forgotten that the Band of Gypsies only played 3 shows before they got disbanded again. But there's many fans that regard this formation as the best that Hendrix ever had. The 2 shows recorded at the Fillmore East around New Year's Day of 1970 are definitely some of the epochal live recordings in rock history. 2 months later, after a disastrous show where Hendrix manager Mike Jeffries would give Hendrix too much LSD and it would end on a bad trip that ended up in a disastrous concert, that also should mean the end of the Band of Gypsies. It's the spring of 1970. Hendrix is working on his Cry of Love album and is about to start the Cry of Love tour with Mitchell and Cox in the band. Billy Cox and Mitch Mitchell definitely feel the friction around him, although some of those performances are still considered some of the best material he ever released, including the footage from the Atlanta Pop Festival. Jimi is not himself. He's tired and burned out from the obligations he had to fulfill. He had to record that Band of Gypsies album just to fulfill a record company contract with Ed Chalpin. And he's thinking of firing Mike Jeffries as his manager. On September 2nd, 1970, Jimi abandons a show in Aarhus and he says, "I've been dead for a long time." But let's hear it from Mitch Mitchell himself that recollects those last months in Jimi's career.
A lot of projects lined up, chances of doing work with people like Miles Davis, Gil Evans, lots of different kinds of music being made, lots of writing going down at that time. He was tired, but you know, who wouldn't be?
This is a question for you now. Why do you think yourself Jimi died?
The wrong time, the wrong place, maybe some of the wrong people, but you know, we are.
Wasn't that scary? It seems like there was a bad spirit in the room or something. So Jimi passed away way too early in September 1970, and his musical plans were pretty much interrupted. Many people wonder what would have been Jimi's next band. Who would he have played with? Some people wonder it might have been Steve Winwood, the organ player. Or other people say, well, he might have collaborated with Miles Davis, who just a year later would release a very similar sounding album that you can definitely hear Jimi on that record. But let's talk to someone that would know best. The engineer that recorded all 4 of Jimi's official releases, Mr. Eddie Kramer.
To absorb something and flip it on its head and make it Jimi. You know?
Right.
But I think where he was headed was a sort of a more broad-based R&B funky kind of thing with the rock overtones. And then definitely horns, strings, big orchestral stuff. I'm pretty sure that was going to come out of it as well.
Let's summarize real quick. In today's episode, I wanted to shine some light on the people that played with Jimi. And I also wanted to highlight how Jimi was also spearheading the power trio movement. You know, just after Cream hit in the winter of 1966, just a few weeks later, Hendrix Experience came out with their first single. And it just all happened so quickly around the same time. We looked at some of the musical differences between Jimi's players and different formations, and we analyzed the sound of Mitchell and Redding versus Buddy Miles and Billy Cox, Band of Gypsies. And then we wrapped it up and shared a few thoughts about what could have been Jimi's next record. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and most importantly, it gave you some inspiration to go back and listen to those recordings, because that's really what it's all about. It's about listening. In fact, I want to go now and listen to those recordings again. I hope to see you back next week, and until then, I appreciate your support of this channel, and please like and comment on this video, and have a great week.